Throughout history, Christians have scrutinized prophecies about the end times, searching for signs that might indicate the approaching fulfillment of biblical predictions. Among these prophecies, few figures have generated more interest and controversy than the Antichrist, a powerful deceiver who, according to certain interpretations of Scripture, will emerge before Christ's return. As global events unfold with unprecedented complexity, many believers find themselves wondering, are we witnessing the stage being set for this prophesied figure? And what role might papal developments play in this unfolding drama? Watch, for you do not know on what day your Lord is coming. These words from Matthew 24:42 remind believers of both the certainty of prophesied events and the uncertainty of their timing. The concept of the Antichrist appears in various biblical passages, most notably in the letters of John, where he is described as the one who denies the Father and the Son, 1 John 2:22, and in Revelation's depiction of beasts who deceive and persecute. Throughout church history, Christians have offered different interpretations of these figures, some viewing them as specific individuals who would arise in the future, others seeing them as symbolic representations of anti-Christian systems or powers. Protestant Reformation leaders like Martin Luther and John Calvin notably connected papal authority with apocalyptic warnings, viewing certain papal claims as potentially fulfilling prophecies about religious deception preceding Christ's return. These interpretations became embedded in certain Protestant traditions, creating interpretive frameworks that continue influencing some contemporary understandings of the papacy's relationship to end-time scenarios. Catholic theology offers substantially different interpretations, typically viewing the Antichrist as a future individual who would overtly oppose Christ rather than claim to represent him. From the Catholic perspective, papal authority represents apostolic succession from Peter rather than fulfilling negative prophetic roles. Eastern Orthodox traditions similarly differ from historical Protestant apocalyptic interpretations, focusing more on spiritual discernment than institutional identification. What makes current discussions particularly significant is the convergence of numerous factors that some prophecy students interpret as setting the stage for end times scenarios. Geopolitical developments involving Israel, technological capabilities enabling unprecedented monitoring and control, environmental challenges of global scale, and economic integration creating potential for worldwide systems. These developments align with various elements described in apocalyptic literature in ways previous generations couldn't have imagined possible. Pope Francis's papacy has coincided with these developments, leading some to question whether his approach to various issues might relate to prophetic warnings about religious developments preceding Christ's return. His emphasis on global cooperation, environmental action, and interreligious dialogue has generated both praise for compassionate engagement and concern from some traditionalists about potential doctrinal boundaries. In exploring these perspectives, it's essential to recognize the diversity of interpretations among sincere Christians. Views on apocalyptic prophecy often reflect broader theological frameworks, denominational backgrounds, and approaches to biblical interpretation. Respectful engagement with these different perspectives allows for thoughtful consideration without unnecessary division. As we examine these questions together, we'll explore different interpretations of key apocalyptic texts, consider how these have been applied to papal authority throughout history, analyze current developments that some connect to prophetic warnings, and evaluate these perspectives with both biblical fidelity and interpretive humility. The historical development of interpretations connecting papal authority to apocalyptic warnings provides essential context for understanding current discussions. These perspectives emerged gradually through different periods of church history, reflecting both theological developments and historical circumstances. In the early church period, 1st through 4th centuries, apocalyptic interpretations focused primarily on the Roman Empire rather than religious leadership. Early church fathers like Irenaeus, Hippolytus, and Tertullian typically identified Revelation's beasts with imperial Rome and pagan religious authority rather than Christian leadership. This focus reflected immediate concerns about persecution from Roman authorities rather than potential corruption within Christian institutions. As Christianity gained political prominence following Constantine's conversion, interpretive approaches shifted. The medieval period saw limited development of apocalyptic interpretations regarding church leadership until the 12th and 13th centuries, when reform movements began questioning aspects of ecclesiastical power. Figures like Arnold of Brescia and later John Wycliffe connected institutional wealth and political power with warnings about spiritual corruption that might precede Christ's return. The Protestant Reformation marked a pivotal development in these interpretations. Martin Luther initially showed restraint in apocalyptic identification, but as conflict with Rome intensified, he explicitly identified the papal system with apocalyptic warnings in works like Against the Roman Papacy, an Institution of the Devil, 1545. John Calvin similarly connected certain papal claims with warnings about religious deception in 2 Thessalonians 2. These Reformation-era interpretations became embedded in numerous Protestant confessional documents. The Westminster Confession of Faith, 1646, influential in Reformed traditions, explicitly identified the Pope of Rome as that Antichrist, that man of sin and son of perdition, that exalts himself in the Church against Christ and all that is called God. Similar statements appeared in various Lutheran, Anglican, and Baptist confessions, establishing traditions that would influence Protestant apocalyptic interpretation for centuries. Catholic responses developed systematically during the Counter-Reformation. Scholars like Cardinal Robert Bellarmine, 1542 to 1621, produced detailed refutations of Protestant apocalyptic interpretations, arguing that biblical descriptions of Antichrist referred either to specific historical figures like Nero or to future individuals who would overtly oppose Christ rather than claim to represent him. This response emphasized that Catholic teaching consistently affirmed Christ's divinity and salvific work, positions directly contradicting the spirit of Antichrist, described in 1 John 2:22 as denying the Father and Son. Eastern Orthodox traditions developed different approaches to apocalyptic interpretation, typically focusing on spiritual discernment rather than institutional identification. The Orthodox concept of prelest, spiritual deception, emphasized discerning spirits within all traditions rather than categorically identifying specific institutions with apocalyptic figures. The 20th century witnessed significant shifts in these interpretations across traditions. Ecumenical movements led many mainstream Protestant denominations to moderate or abandon historical anti-papal apocalyptic interpretations. Vatican II, 1962 to 1965, transformed Catholic engagement with other Christian traditions, acknowledging past institutional failures while seeking dialogue rather than condemnation. These developments created space for more nuanced discussions across denominational boundaries. Contemporary perspectives range widely across different Christian traditions. Some evangelical and fundamentalist communities maintain historical interpretations connecting papal authority to apocalyptic warnings, particularly in dispensationalist frameworks that view church history through prophetic lenses. Other Protestant traditions have significantly moderated these views, maintaining theological differences regarding papal authority while avoiding apocalyptic accusations. Catholic and Orthodox traditions consistently reject interpretations connecting papal office with apocalyptic figures, while acknowledging that any Christian leader could potentially deviate from authentic faith. This position distinguishes between the office itself and potential failures of individuals holding that office, maintaining that Christ's promise to guide his church prevents institutional apostasy even while acknowledging potential individual failures. These diverse perspectives demonstrate how apocalyptic interpretation often reflects broader theological frameworks and historical contexts rather than simply textual analysis. Understanding this interpretive diversity helps approach current discussions with both historical awareness and respectful engagement across different traditions. The specific biblical texts that inform discussions about the Antichrist and potential connections to religious leadership deserve careful examination. Several key passages have particularly influenced interpretive traditions regarding the relationship between papal authority and apocalyptic expectations. The term Antichrist appears explicitly only in John's epistles, where it describes both a specific figure and a broader spirit. Dear children, this is the last hour, and as you have heard that the Antichrist is coming, even now many Antichrists have come. Who is the liar? It is whoever denies that Jesus is the Christ. Such a person is the Antichrist, denying the Father and the Son. 1 John 2:18-22. This text establishes opposition to Christ's nature and work as the defining characteristic of Antichrist figures. Paul's warning in 2 Thessalonians 2:3-4 about the man of lawlessness has significantly influenced apocalyptic interpretation. Don't let anyone deceive you in any way, for that day will not come until the rebellion occurs and the man of lawlessness is revealed, the man doomed to destruction. He will oppose and will exalt himself over everything that is called God or is worshipped, so that he sets himself up in God's temple, proclaiming himself to be God. This passage generated particular attention during the Reformation era, with Protestant interpreters connecting it to certain papal claims. Martin Luther and others specifically cited ceremonial elements like the sedia gestatoria, portable papal throne, and particular titles like Vicar of Christ as potentially fulfilling warnings about religious figures claiming divine prerogatives. Catholic theologians consistently rejected these interpretations, emphasizing that papal authority claims represented Christ's delegated authority rather than self-deification. The beast imagery in Revelation 13 has likewise played central role in these interpretive traditions. The text describes a beast from the sea with 10 horns and 7 heads, with 10 crowns on its horns, and on each head a blasphemous name that exercises authority, demands worship, and persecutes believers. A second beast from earth directs worship toward the first beast and implements economic control requiring a mark for commercial participation. Protestant Reformation traditions often identified papal Rome with aspects of these apocalyptic symbols, particularly noting Rome's geographical setting on 7 hills connected to the 7 heads in Revelation 17-9, and historical exercise of both religious and political authority. Catholic interpretations typically viewed these symbols as representing imperial Rome and pagan religion during John's time, with potential future applications to overtly anti-Christian powers rather than Christian leadership. What makes these diverse interpretations particularly significant is how they often reflect broader hermeneutical approaches rather than simply isolated textual disagreements. Different traditions approach apocalyptic literature through distinct interpretive frameworks that significantly influence their conclusions. Historical critical approaches emphasize reading Revelation within its first-century context as literature addressing the immediate challenges faced by Christians under Roman persecution. From this perspective, apocalyptic symbols primarily represented contemporary Roman imperial power and emperor worship, rather than distant future developments. Historicist interpretations view Revelation as outlining major periods of church history from the apostolic era through Christ's return. This approach, common in classical Protestant traditions, often connected papal developments with specific apocalyptic symbols, while identifying other symbols with various historical events and movements throughout church history. Futurist interpretations, prevalent in contemporary dispensationalist frameworks, typically place most of Revelation's fulfillment in a future tribulation period. While some dispensationalist traditions maintain historical Protestant connections between papal authority and certain apocalyptic warnings, others focus primarily on future manifestations distinct from existing religious institutions. Idealist approaches view Revelation's symbols as representing timeless spiritual principles rather than specific historical events or institutions. This perspective, common in many mainline Protestant, Catholic, and Orthodox traditions, emphasizes discerning spiritual patterns that manifest in different forms throughout history, rather than identifying specific institutions with particular symbols. These diverse approaches demonstrate that differences regarding papal connections to apocalyptic figures often reflect fundamentally different ways of reading apocalyptic literature itself. Understanding these hermeneutical distinctions helps approach current discussions with both interpretive awareness and charitable engagement across traditions. When examining scriptural descriptions of the Antichrist figure and similar apocalyptic roles, several consistent elements emerge. First, opposition to authentic Christian teaching, particularly regarding Christ's nature and work, represents the fundamental Antichrist characteristic, 1 John 2:22. Second, religious deception rather than merely political opposition characterizes apocalyptic warnings, Matthew 24:24. Third, signs and wonders that appear spiritually impressive but lead away from authentic faith accompany this deception, 2 Thessalonians 2:9-10. These biblical characteristics have influenced how different traditions evaluate potential connections between papal developments and apocalyptic warnings. Protestant traditions have historically questioned certain aspects of Catholic teaching regarding Mary, saints, and sacraments as potentially diverging from Christ-centered worship. Catholic theology has consistently maintained that these practices properly understood direct worship toward Christ rather than diverting it, making papal teaching fundamentally incompatible with Antichrist characteristics described in Scripture. This theological evaluation transcends simply institutional identification to address substantive questions about authentic Christian teaching. Regardless of denominational perspective, Scripture establishes that genuinely Antichrist influences would fundamentally oppose rather than affirm Christ's divine nature, redemptive work, and unique mediation. Essential doctrines officially maintained in Catholic teaching, despite Protestant concerns about certain practices. Current global developments have led many prophecy students to believe we might be approaching the fulfillment of biblical end-times scenarios. These developments, coinciding with Pope Francis's papacy, have generated significant discussion regarding potential prophetic significance. Several aspects of Pope Francis's approach have particularly captured attention among those studying apocalyptic prophecy. His emphasis on global cooperation across religious boundaries has generated both praise and concern. The 2019 document on human fraternity, signed with Grand Imam Ahmad al-Tayyib, stated that the pluralism and the diversity of religions, color, sex, race, and language are willed by God in his wisdom. Language sum. Traditionalists questioned as potentially relativizing exclusive truth claims central to Christian faith. Francis's environmental emphasis through Laudato Si represents another element some connect to apocalyptic expectations. While creation care itself aligns with biblical stewardship, certain aspects of proposed environmental solutions involving global governance structures have led some prophecy students to question whether these might potentially align with prophetic warnings about worldwide systems preceding Christ's return. The Vatican's involvement with international economic initiatives has similarly generated prophetic discussion. Francis has supported proposals for reformed global financial systems and economic integration that some interpreters connect to apocalyptic warnings about eventual economic control. His 2020 endorsement of the Great Reset initiative following the COVID-19 pandemic particularly captured attention among those studying prophecies. Regarding global economic restructuring, technological developments during Francis's papacy have created unprecedented capabilities that some connect to specific apocalyptic warnings. Advancements in digital identification, cryptocurrency systems, artificial intelligence, and comprehensive monitoring technologies have established infrastructure potentially capable of implementing systems described in Revelation 13 regarding economic participation requiring specific identification. While Francis has advocated for ethical technology use, his support for digital inclusion initiatives has led some to question whether these might unintentionally facilitate prophesied control systems. The Vatican's diplomatic initiatives during Francis's leadership have included remarkable geopolitical developments related to Israel, a nation central to many prophetic interpretations. His support for Palestinian statehood, engagement with Middle East peace processes, and positioning regarding Jerusalem's status involve precisely the geographical areas most frequently associated with culminating prophetic fulfillment across diverse interpretive traditions. Beyond specific policies, Francis's distinctive leadership style has captured prophetic attention. His emphasis on mercy over judgment, inclusion over boundary enforcement, and environmental priority over traditional moral emphasis represents significant shifts in papal messaging. While many celebrate these shifts as compassionate modernization, others question whether such changes might potentially align with warnings about theological boundaries becoming less distinct preceding end-times deception. What makes these developments particularly significant for apocalyptic interpretation is their convergence within a single historical moment. Previous generations might have identified isolated elements potentially fulfilling specific prophecies, but current circumstances feature simultaneous alignment of multiple factors: technological capability, economic integration, environmental challenges, Middle East developments, and religious reconfiguration, creating what many view as unprecedented prophetic convergence. Catholic perspectives on these developments differ substantially from traditional Protestant apocalyptic interpretations. From Catholic theological frameworks, Francis's emphasis on environmental stewardship, global solidarity, and inclusive pastoral approach represents authentic application of gospel principles rather than concerning departure. His explicit affirmations of essential Catholic doctrine regarding Christ's nature, the Trinity, and salvation's necessity demonstrate fundamental incompatibility with Antichrist characteristics described in Scripture as denying these core truths. Orthodox Christian perspectives typically emphasize discernment of spirits within all religious expressions, rather than institutional identification with apocalyptic figures. This approach recognizes that deceptive influences can manifest within any tradition, including Orthodox, Catholic, and Protestant communities, when Christ's centrality becomes displaced by other priorities. From this perspective, evaluating potential prophetic fulfillment involves examining spiritual fruits rather than institutional labels. Evangelical Protestant responses to these developments vary widely depending on interpretive traditions. Those maintaining historical Protestant identification of papal authority with apocalyptic warnings often view Francis's global initiatives as potentially fulfilling these concerns. Others, particularly in mainline Protestant traditions, have moderated historical anti-papal interpretations while maintaining theological differences regarding certain Catholic distinctives. This diversity of perspective demonstrates how apocalyptic interpretation often reflects predetermined theological frameworks rather than simply responding to current events. Different interpretive traditions approach the same developments through distinct hermeneutical lenses, leading to significantly different conclusions regarding their prophetic significance. What bridges many of these diverse perspectives is recognition that Scripture consistently warns believers to maintain spiritual discernment regarding all religious expressions, including their own traditions. Jesus warned that false prophets would be known by their fruits, Matthew 7:15-20, establishing character evidence and practical outcomes rather than institutional affiliation as criteria for authentic spiritual leadership. This scriptural emphasis on discernment provides common ground for believers across traditions while navigating differences regarding specific prophetic interpretations. Whatever one's view regarding potential connections between papal developments and apocalyptic expectations, Scripture clearly calls all believers to evaluate religious leadership based on faithfulness to Christ's teaching rather than impressive appearance or institutional position. As we consider whether current developments might relate to biblical warnings about the Antichrist, several balanced perspectives emerge that acknowledge legitimate prophetic concerns while avoiding both dismissive skepticism and unwarranted certainty. First, Scripture consistently emphasizes maintaining vigilant awareness regarding potential spiritual deception while avoiding excessive speculation about specific fulfillments. Jesus warned about false messiahs and prophets who would deceive, if possible, even the elect, Matthew 24:24, establishing legitimate concern about sophisticated religious deception. Yet he simultaneously cautioned against timeline fixation, emphasizing that about the day or hour no one knows, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father, Matthew 24:36. This balanced biblical approach suggests taking prophetic warnings seriously without claiming excessive certainty about their specific application. Second, authentic prophetic discernment examines spiritual substance rather than merely institutional labels. John's epistles identify the fundamental characteristic of Antichrist influence as denial of essential truth about Christ's nature and redemptive work. 1 John 2:22, establishing theological content rather than institutional affiliation as the primary criterion. This scriptural emphasis suggests evaluating all religious expressions, including papal teaching, based on faithfulness to essential Christian doctrine rather than predetermined apocalyptic frameworks. Third, biblical warnings about end-times deception consistently indicate that such influence would appear spiritually impressive rather than obviously evil. Paul specifically warned that Satan himself masquerades as an angel of light, 2 Corinthians 11:14, indicating that deceptive influences would present themselves as spiritually positive rather than overtly opposing Christian values. Jesus similarly cautioned about false prophets appearing as sheep while inwardly being ferocious wolves, Matthew 7:15. This scriptural pattern suggests that potential Antichrist influences would likely involve subtle deviation from authentic faith, rather than obvious opposition to Christian principles. Fourth, prophecy serves primarily to prepare believers spiritually, rather than satisfy predictive curiosity. Throughout Scripture, prophetic warning aims at inspiring faithful living rather than merely identifying future events. Peter specifically emphasized that prophecy exists as a light shining in a dark place until the day dawns, 2 Peter 1:19, establishing its purpose as guidance rather than speculation. This biblical understanding suggests approaching potential prophetic fulfillment with focus on personal spiritual preparedness rather than detailed identification of specific figures. Fifth, Scripture consistently presents prophecy's fulfillment as often surprising even knowledgeable observers. Jesus specifically noted that many who thought themselves spiritually prepared would miss prophetic fulfillment, stating that many will say to me on that day, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name, yet find themselves unrecognized, Matthew 7:22-23. This biblical pattern suggests approaching prophetic interpretation with appropriate humility regarding our ability to recognize fulfillment with certainty. For believers across different traditions navigating these questions, several balanced approaches emerge from biblical wisdom. First, maintain vigilant awareness of biblical warnings while avoiding excessive speculation, taking prophecy seriously without claiming definitive understanding of its application. Second, evaluate all religious expressions, including those within one's own tradition, based on faithfulness to Christ's teaching rather than institutional affiliation. Third, focus on personal spiritual preparation through practices that maintain authentic relationship with God, regardless of specific prophetic timelines. Catholic approaches to these questions typically emphasize distinguishing between the papal office itself and potential failures of individuals holding that office, while maintaining that Christ's promise to guide his church prevents institutional apostasy. Catholic theology acknowledges that individual leaders throughout church history have sometimes failed to exemplify Christian virtues. This nuanced position allows for recognizing potential concerns about specific approaches while avoiding categorical rejection of papal authority itself. Protestant perspectives on these questions vary widely. Some traditions maintain historical interpretations connecting papal claims with apocalyptic warnings, viewing current developments as potentially confirming these concerns. Others have significantly moderated these views while maintaining theological differences regarding certain Catholic distinctives. This diversity demonstrates how prophetic interpretation often reflects broader theological frameworks rather than simply textual analysis. Whatever one's perspective regarding potential connections between papal developments and apocalyptic expectations, Scripture clearly calls all believers to maintain spiritual discernment regarding every religious expression, including their own traditions. Jesus established fruits rather than impressive appearance as the criterion for authentic spiritual leadership, Matthew 7:20, providing guidance that transcends denominational boundaries. Perhaps most importantly, biblical prophecy consistently aims at inspiring hope rather than fear. Even apocalyptic literature, with its sobering warnings, ultimately emphasizes God's sovereignty over history and final victory over all opposing powers. This prophetic hope transforms how believers approach potential fulfillment, not with anxious speculation, but confident trust that God's purposes will ultimately prevail, regardless of temporary challenges. What emerges from balanced consideration of these questions is recognition that while sincere believers may reach different conclusions regarding specific prophetic applications, Scripture provides shared guidance for navigating these differences with both discernment and charity. The biblical command to test everything, hold fast what is good, 1 Thessalonians 5:21, offers wisdom that transcends particular apocalyptic interpretations, calling believers to thoughtful evaluation rather than either uncritical acceptance or dismissive rejection. The convergence of current global developments, technological capability, economic integration, religious reconfiguration, Middle East developments, and environmental challenges certainly merits thoughtful consideration regarding potential prophetic significance. While interpretations differ regarding how these developments might relate to biblical expectations about the Antichrist, the unprecedented alignment of factors identified in apocalyptic literature suggests approaching current events with both spiritual alertness and interpretive humility. In conclusion, whether one views Pope Francis's papacy as potentially related to apocalyptic warnings or representing authentic Christian leadership amid challenging times, Scripture calls all believers to maintain both doctrinal fidelity and spiritual discernment. The biblical emphasis on recognizing spiritual fruit rather than merely institutional position offers guidance that transcends denominational boundaries while navigating differences. Regarding specific prophetic interpretations, like, share, subscribe, and comment with your thoughts on how believers might approach prophetic warnings with both serious attention and appropriate balance. How do you maintain spiritual discernment without falling into either dismissive skepticism or excessive speculation? The wisest approach to prophecy maintains both vigilant awareness of biblical warnings and humble recognition that God's ways often transcend our interpretive frameworks. True prophetic discernment produces neither fearful obsession nor dismissive complacency, but faithful preparation through deepened relationship with Christ Himself. Timothy Keller.